I'm slowly working my way through some different versions of the Spitfire Mk.V, and this time I thought it would be fun to have a go at the Spitfire Mk.Va from Airfix. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I explore this particular version of the Spitfire. For a deeper dive inside the box of this kit to explore the plastic parts, instructions and paint schemes, check out the dedicated unboxing video I've already made on that topic, and in that one I compared it to two other variants of the Spitfire Mk.V from Airfix. In this one I'm going to be exploring what this kit is like to build and rounding off with a review at the end. A list of products is on the screen here to give you an idea of the kind of things to go and get if you fancy having a go at this particular project for yourself. And without any further ado, let's get into it. As usual, I'll cut the parts away from the sprue using my cutters or perhaps a sharp knife. Any flash or excess plastic can be carefully sanded away. This particular version of the Spitfire is based off of the Mark I tooling that Airfix have had in their range for quite a while, but the moulding is reasonably crisp. Having cleaned up the various parts that I need, Tamiya extra thin cement will be my glue of choice in this build. As is quite standard for an aircraft kit, I'm going to start this project by assembling the cockpit components. This is built up in a number of parts, with the control panel being attached to the cockpit floor, a rear bulkhead added as well, a control column glued into the floor, and after a little bit of flash removal, the pilot's seat was glued onto the rear bulkhead. This assembly was then glued into one of the fuselage halves. I like to do these things at this point so that I get a good plastic to plastic bond for the cement. These cylinders are glued in behind the cockpit on their little mounting point, and then it was time to get some paint onto this assembly. Hataka Interior Grey-Green was loaded into my airbrush and then sprayed over all the internal areas of the cockpit. I'm doing this straight onto the bare plastic as this is a low traffic area and I shouldn't be handling too much of this and running the risk of removing the paint. A couple of thin coats would be needed to get good coverage. Humbrol 62, which is a leather colour, was carefully painted onto the pilot's headrest and also the padding on the rear of his seat. Humbrol 32, which is a dark grey, was painted onto the control panel, reflector gun sight and the top of the control stick. Ammo MiG polished metal was painted onto those cylinders on the rear wall of the fuselage. There is a decal included for the control panel, so this had been cut from the sheet, soaked in warm water and then carefully positioned. I've already painted the pilot figure using my normal techniques, but unfortunately this pilot is a generic figure and doesn't quite fit without some modification. I carefully trimmed away his feet, and now he should fit quite snugly inside of the cockpit. With that done, I closed up the fuselage halves, and the fit is generally okay at this point. The next step was to glue the lower wing surface onto the fuselage as well. You might be able to notice that I've already painted the areas where the machine guns are in the wings in some dark grey paint. This should just hide those areas and make them less obvious. The upper wing surfaces are then carefully added as well. Do take a little bit of time here just to make sure the fit is alright and you don't have a gap at the wing root. The tail surfaces could be added as well. There are some little slots at the rear of the aircraft for them to pop into, and the rudder could also be attached to the back of the tail. On the lower side of the aircraft I added the pitot tube towards the wingtip, the tail wheel at the rear of the tail, and then the two air intakes. Whilst this is based off of the Spitfire Mark I tooling, there is actually extra parts to help replicate either a Mark II, an early Mark I, or a Mk.Va. So there are some differences here from the standard Mark I. On the top of the aircraft I added the aerial mast, and I need to be careful handling this so that I don't knock any of these details off. Turning my attention to the propeller, this is glued onto the back plate and then the spinner glued over the top. If you wanted to have a freely rotating prop, you would have had to add this much earlier. I'm just going to glue it in at the end of the build. A common problem with this particular tooling is that the canopy is ever so slightly too long. A simple fix is to sand about 0.5 mm off the back of the canopy, and with that done it should fit quite snugly. Having built a number of these Mark I toolings in the past, you kind of get used to where these little problems are. So I masked the cockpit canopy off camera using my normal techniques, and then some clear fix would be used to glue the canopy into place. This is a clear glue which should dry clear and strong without reacting with the plastic. If you'd like to know more about how I mask the canopy, check out my standalone tutorial on that technique. And with that done, it's time to prime. I've been enjoying using this Army Painter matte black primer recently, and I sprayed a couple of thin coats onto the entire aircraft and the parts which I've not yet attached. This should give a nice base layer for the next paints to stick to, and also some of these parts will remain in the black colour, such as the tyres on the wheels. For the camouflage, the first colour I'm going to use is this Hataka Medium Sea Grey. This was loaded into the airbrush and then sprayed onto the lower surface of the aircraft. I'm not too worried about doing any pre-shading or complicated painting here. I'm just going to go for a nice smooth even finish. I'm treating this a bit like a weekend build, and I kind of just want to have a little bit of fun and get this project complete. With the lower surfaces drying, some Humbrol 90, which is a sky colour, would be carefully hand painted onto the spinner. I decided to do it this way because the propeller blades are already black and I didn't want to have to mask them. Again, a couple of thin coats of this paint should give a nice uniform finish. For the tips of the propeller, I'm going to use a little bit of Humbrol 24, which is a trainer yellow, and this just picks out where the dangerous spinny bits are. Now, with the lower surfaces of the aircraft dry, the next paint I would use is this Ocean Grey. You can see that I've already masked off the lower surfaces so that I don't get any paint in the wrong places. The Ocean Grey was sprayed over the entire top surface of the aircraft, again just building up a nice uniform layer. This would be left to dry before I moved on to mask the grey areas. So what I've actually done is I've been out and I've bought some AML camouflage painting masks. I do quite enjoy using camouflage painting masks because they normally give quite neat results. These are pre-cut vinyl, and following the instructions I peeled off the relevant pieces that I needed and stuck them into position. I do find these relatively easy to apply, and actually applying the masks sometimes takes more time than actually painting the model. Whilst the AML masks are cut to a good size and have nice shape, and generally work quite well, there are a few little places where an extra bit of tape needs to be used, just to cover any areas that they don't quite fully protect. With that done though, the next paint I would use is the dark green from Hataka. Again loaded into the airbrush, this would be sprayed over the areas which were not protected by the masks. I would build this up again just to create a nice uniform colour. When that was mostly dry, I carefully peeled away the vinyl masks, and a top tip, if you're careful and stick them back onto the backing paper, you might be able to get another use out of them on another project. With the painting mostly complete, it's time to turn my attention to the decals. So you get two paint schemes included in this kit. One is a Spitfire Mk.II, or alternatively the Mk.V that I'm going to go for. I identified the decals that I needed and carefully cut them from the backing sheet. With the decals now in more manageable sections, I dipped them into some warm water to help release them from the backing paper. And if you ever get confused with your cup of tea or your brush water, why don't you check out the merch store and get a brush water mug. It will certainly help the channel, and you should never mix up your brush water and tea again. I'm going to use some VMS decal softener and set and fix as my setting solutions for the transfers. First up, set and fix would be painted lightly onto the areas where the decals are going to go. This should act almost a bit like a glue and help soften them into the surface and stick them down. The decals, having been soaked in warm water, are then slid into position and carefully manipulated until they are in the right place. Decal application was relatively straightforwards. I didn't have any real problems with this, but there are quite a few stencils and things which needed to be added. These were a little bit fiddly, and there was a little risk of tearing them. This is a slightly older product, and as a result I think the Cartograph decals may have either aged a little bit or are perhaps not quite up to the modern standards that we have from Cartograph. These transfers were a little bit thicker. There were a few little places where they did seem to not quite want to conform to the surface details, and maybe were a little papery, but with some repeated applications of the VMS decal softener, actually they went on pretty nice, and you wouldn't really be able to tell. So yeah, decal application, generally quite straightforward. The decals went on okay. I just had to take a little bit more care and patience, especially to get all of the various stencils in place. As mentioned, a couple of applications of the decal softener just helped to ensure that they had fully settled into the surface details, and I would leave them to cure. Whilst the decals are curing, I'm going to use some polished metal on the centres of the wheels. I did this carefully using a fine paintbrush to try and avoid getting it on the tyres, which are painted black already, and I don't want to have to do extra work. I also carefully painted this metallic colour onto the landing gear legs, which are moulded as one piece onto the door covers. I mixed up some dirty down rust colour with the polished metal to give a kind of burnt metal effect. This was painted onto the engine exhausts. This is something I quite enjoy doing, as it does give a fairly nice burnt exhaust metal kind of colour. Vallejo black makes an appearance here, and this was carefully painted onto the tyre on the tail wheel. Turning my attention to the main landing gear, the correct wheels were glued onto the relevant legs. These tyres do have a flattened edge, so you need to make sure you get them in the right position so that it is flush with the surface of the ground and appears as though there is weight pushing through the wheels. These landing gear legs could then be carefully attached in the right place on the aircraft. The engine exhausts could be glued into their slots on the side of the nose, and then the propeller pushed onto the front of the model. To seal everything in, I'm going to use some of this K-Colors XW1, which is an ultra matte paint. This varnish was loaded into the airbrush and then sprayed over the entire aircraft. Surprisingly though, what can you expect from an ultra matte paint but an ultra matte finish, and I just thought it was far too flat. So to bring it up a little bit, I'm going to use some of this custom service satin varnish, and a very light coat of this would be applied just to give it an ever so slightly shinier look. And this is sometimes a thing of modelling, isn't it? If you go too far in one direction, sometimes you have to come back in the opposite one. On the bottom of the aircraft there is this, I think it's a landing light. I did add a little bit of silver paint in there earlier, and now I glued into place the clear part. One extra step I want to do with this aircraft is add the aerial wire. I'm going to use some of this Ushi Rig That Thing fine elastic thread and a little bit of super glue. This is very fine and fiddly, but my process here was to attach a little blob of super glue, then let the elastic kind of sit and cure in that little pool. Then once it was glued in that position, I would stretch it to the next one, let it glue in that position, and then any excess could be cut away. This is a very fine thread and it's not particularly visible in the finished images. Maybe I need to get a slightly thicker one, just to make it a little bit more noticeable. The final step was to carefully peel away my homemade canopy masks, and with that I'm going to call my build of the Airfix Spitfire Mk.Va in 1/72 scale complete. And that's another build under the belt. I'm going to do my normal thing at the moment where I talk about things I didn't really like and then swing into the more positive aspects. So this is a slightly older tooling. As I mentioned, it's based off of the Spitfire Mk.V tooling from Airfix, and that one has a few known issues, such as the panel lines are quite deep and a little bit unrealistic. In more recent releases from Airfix, they have addressed this and the panel lines are much more subtle, but as this is something they've had in their range for quite a while now, this is just a known problem with the kit. Because those panel lines were quite deep, I didn't see the point in adding a wash or anything to bring them out, just letting natural shadow give that effect. I also quite like this in its pristine condition, and I didn't add any extra weathering such as engine or gun smoke stains, which is a step I could go a little bit further with, but to be honest I really like how it looks at the moment. Of course there are a few little fit issues, the canopy being one, and that again is a known issue. Having built this a number of times, I know I need to remove a little bit of plastic from the back of the canopy, and also the pilot not fitting and having to remove his feet is also a problem of generic pilot figures. Not all pilot figures are designed to fit every single cockpit because lots of cockpits are different. The decals for the most part were printed really lovely and went onto the model quite well, but as I mentioned earlier, they do feel like a slightly older generation of cartograph decals, and there were a few little places where they did seem a little bit papery and maybe didn't want to quite conform to the surface details. Other than that though, this was a very pleasant build. The Spitfire Mk.V tooling does build up into quite a nice looking aircraft, and it's relatively quick to do. I do keep a note of everything that I do in my modelling journal, which is a bit like a diary, and I've written these specifically to keep a track of my builds on the workbench. You can keep a track of your own builds on your workbenches as well by getting your own copies by checking out the links in the description. In here I've written down that this genuinely took me a weekend. This was a weekend build and it was nice, pleasant and fun. Those airmail masks generally do quite a good job and give a really nice camouflage paint scheme. I didn't have any paint bleed and I'm really quite happy with the finish on this one. It's quite a neat and clean build to my eye. So given the fact that this is based off of the Spitfire Mk.V tooling, the tooling date for this is from 2010. There are parts added to this though, and there is an extra sprue which have parts which can represent an early Mk.V with a two-bladed propeller. There are parts for a Mk.II, and there's also parts, as I used in this one, for a Mk.V. I think I might be able to save some of those other parts and actually replicate a Mk.I early or a Mk.II if I can get my hands on another Spitfire Mk.V kit. So maybe I'll do that in the future. This particular kit dates from 2016 and hasn't actually been seen since then. So a decade ago, perhaps it's due for a re-release at some point in the future. I'm not entirely sure what the recommended retail price was 10 years ago, but I expect it was in the ballpark of £9.99. But sadly, seeing as this is effectively discontinued, the only place you could find this particular version would be on the second-hand market, so I would definitely suggest you shop around for the best price if this is something you wanted to add to your stash. I think though it's probably time to wrap this one up here. This is a kit that, although it does have a few known flaws with it, I do think it builds up into a rather pleasant and enjoyable build. I'm quite happy with my finished results here, and having already completed a Mk.V and a Mk.V, maybe it's time to look at a Mk.V in the future. And as we've come to the end of the video, it's time to give my Model Club members a quick shout out to thank these guys on screen for the extra support they give the channel. Becoming a Model Club member means you get exclusive access to early videos and other perks, and it helps me to create consistent content. I'd like to welcome our latest members to the club. They are Narazuri and Matt Connolly. Thanks for joining us. Full information on how to become a Model Club member is in the description below. Alternatively, if you'd like to help support the channel in other ways, there are options underneath the video as well. The best way to support the channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.